Evidence that populations change over time. Scientific theories are based on large amounts of evidence gathered through observation and experimentation and are generally accepted by the experts in the field. The phrase, "it's just a theory," is misleading and leads to wrong conclusions. We have already seen some evidence that natural selection occurs and populations change over time. Let's take a look at some other lines of evidence supporting the theory of evolution.
Evidence. Populations change over time. The evidence will be presented in 4 areas: fossils, anatomy comparisons, DNA and protein sequence comparisons, animal embryo comparisons, and biogeography.
Fossils are preserved when sedimentary rock forms around the remains of living things. Very old layers of sedimentary rock can be lifted to the surface by plate tectonics, giving us access to old fossils. We know how old fossils are because we can tell the age of the rock in which they are preserved. Numerous fossil discoveries allow us to trace the evolution of living species to their extinct ancestors. The deepest layers of rock are the oldest layers. Fossils tell us about the bodies of extinct species and how species have changed. For many living species, such as the horse, we have very complete fossil records, with teeth and bone samples from many time points. Look at the changes in the forefeet and teeth of the horse over the last 55 million years. They show change over time, evolution, from Hyracotherium to Equus. The stromatolites are the oldest fossils of life on Earth. They are fossilized bacterial colonies and are 3.6 billion years old. The Ediacaran fossil is approximately 550 million years old. It was one of the earliest multicellular animals. This video is about the most completely preserved dinosaur specimen ever found. It's not just a skeleton, it's a whole dinosaur. The nodosaur lived 110 million years ago. Click here to watch the dinosaur video. The best fossil evidence for evolution are transitional fossils. Transitional fossils are from extinct species, but they show us the intermediate body plans between old and new types of species. They show a path from ancestors to their descendants. They possess features of both the ancestors and their descendants. Since evolution is the change in populations over time, it is supported by physical evidence of intermediate steps, transitions from old to new. Mahakala is a transitional fossil between dinosaurs and birds. It shows features of both dinosaurs and birds and indicates that birds evolved from dinosaurs. Tiktaalik is a transitional fossil between fish and amphibians. It shows features of both fish and amphibians and indicates that amphibians evolved from fish. Anatomy is the study of body structures. When we compare the anatomies of different types of organisms, we see similar structures used over and over again, but in each species the structure may have changed over time and become adapted to carry out different functions. The best explanation is that they evolved from a common ancestor with these characteristics. This is evidence for descent with modification. All the skeletons in this picture are from different species, but they all have skulls, backbones, forelimbs, and ribs. Evidence for descent with modification from a common ancestor. Homologous structures are parts of animals that look similar to parts of other animals, even if they perform different functions. They are evidence for a common ancestor. The figure on the next slide shows limb bones of 4 different mammals. They are labeled with the functions that each perform for the identified mammal. Here we have a human arm. It's used for grabbing, throwing, holding, and fine manipulation. Here we have a cat leg, or cat limb, that's used for jumping, landing, and running. Here, in a whale, that same appendage is used for swimming and changing direction, and in a bat, it's used for flying. Natural selection placed pressure on ancient populations. Not all organisms could get enough to eat, avoid predators, and reproduce in their ecosystems. Variations in limbs that could help swim, fly, walk on land, hold things, or dig in soil were advantageous for the individuals that had them. Over millions of years, the limbs changed and new species emerged as adaptations were selectively passed to offspring. The limbs of all these organisms, including humans, evolved from a fish. The Galapagos finches are evidence for a common ancestor as shown in this tree of life. Their populations evolved over time as finches with the right beak for the seeds in their environment were able to survive and reproduce more.
Vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures on an organism which have lost function and atrophied or shrunk through time. The body part had a function in an ancestor, but through modifications and evolution, the body part is no longer useful. So, for example, here we have the flightless cormorant, which is the descendant of a bird that can fly. But over time, it adapted for different purposes, didn't need to fly anymore, and so the wings have just shrunk down and atrophied. Vestigial bones. Whales have a femur, or a thigh bone for a leg, and a pelvis, or a hip bone. Both of these bones are associated with walking, but we know that whales don't walk, they swim, so it is believed that the whale evolved from an ancestor who was able to walk on land, and then as this ancestor became more associated with the water, it was more advantageous for this ancestor to swim and to develop other structures for swimming, and then consequently, the bones associated with walking just became smaller and smaller, and then here they are today. Similar story with the snake. Snakes have hips and leg bones as well, but they've evolved more for slithering on the ground, and then these bones are no longer useful and they just shrink over time. A vestigial organ, the human appendix. What is now the human appendix was once an extra pouch to help digest food back when our ancestors were herbivores, and ate mainly plant material. Since then, humans have developed into more of an omnivore, eating both meat and plants, so the pouch lost both its function and its original structure.